Well, hello there. I hope you're doing well. And it's kind of a rainy, overcast day today. Well, I'm seeing some sun right now, but it was definitely raining this morning. And this morning, since it's actually morning instead of afternoon, I'm drinking Kawava Idawali. It is got some really interesting caramel flavors. It's got some little bite to it, but it's really good. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Kawava. So today we're going to discuss two books that I decided to read because of the reaction to the Charlie Kirk murder. Personally, I found Charlie Kirk repugnant, and he dressed up white nationalism in a suit and was respectable, you could say. So he took the KKK out of the hood, the white hood. He said horrific things, and I don't think overall he was a very positive influence on the world. I don't think he should have been killed, but I also don't think we should have been giving him this level of adoration that he's been getting. He did not. He said abhorrent things. He thought that people should be killed. I don't think that assassination is the right way to deal with people like Charlie Kirk. We do need to come up with some way to actually deal with them because we are failing as a society to do that. And I think that the books that I read have some ideas around how to deal with that. So the first book I read is called Against Civility by Alex Zamalin. It was published in February of 2022. I was fairly surprised by this book because I focused primarily on the main title and missed the subtitle, which was The Hidden Racism in Our Obsession with Civility. And the book goes through kind of the whole history of the United States from whenever kind of the first slaves landed in the United States. So I guess it's not the entire history, but it's definitely a lot of the history, and it does deal with even racism towards Native Americans or Indigenous Americans, and just the complexity around. Well, I don't even know if it was really complex. Just the behavior of white immigrants to the United States, and it really focuses on how white Americans controlled the language that Black Americans or Black American allies could communicate by policing their language. Even though the men on the other side, they didn't really adhere to the exact same criteria. Charlie Kirk, would he was a perfect example of this. He spouted horrific things of people with a variety of backgrounds. He would outright call people thugs, George Floyd being one of them. That is uncivil language. But because of the inherent racism in a lot of our language, it is accepted. And if someone tried to argue against that by calling Charlie Kirk a racist, they would be called uncivil. There would be, So right now, if someone says anything against Charlie Kirk on the radical left, uh, his defenders are literally collecting that information and sending it to their employers and getting those people fired. Random people. They're not even. It's not even people who have a real serious platform. They are some random guy or woman on Twitter who is getting fired for this, and I think that is crossing a line that I didn't expect to be crossed. I understand whenever someone who is a random person who is spouting racist rhetoric that is talking about the great replacement theory or something, and they get fired for that. That's because that's a reputational harm for that company. I don't really know how Charlie Kirk caused, someone saying something bad against Charlie Kirk is causing reputational harm. So much of the book, which there's a lot of things I was already aware of because I've read books like White Rage, which is a similar sort of book again like this. But it's always interesting to get other perspectives on something like this. And Against Civility argues a lot of interesting things. One, Lincoln wasn't really the abolitionist that we portray him as. And, in other books, they talk about that too. But kind of specifically, he was even looking at moving Black Americans out of the U.S. And he wasn't really truly an abolitionist until he was kind of forced into doing it. And even Frederick Douglass, who is someone who really didn't practice civility, who was very critical of a lot of different people, he also was a supporter of taking freed Black people to Africa. But as he learned more about everything, because he was an enslaved person who had to kind of catch up on his learnings once he was freed. He had changed his mind. And Reconstruction itself is another example of civility being used against Black Americans and trying to change things. Reconstruction was really driving a lot of changes in Southern culture. And as soon as Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Jackson just said, no, we're not going to do all that, and just let his fellow white supremacists be in charge of the South. That eventually evolved into Jim Crow, and people are arguing that today we're kind of experiencing a Jim Crow 2.0, which I definitely agree with, where you have people like Charlie Kirk who are able to say basically whatever they want. Good violence is good, that Black people are, Black women are dumb. Zamolin also kind of decides to pivot away from focusing on just what white people was saying to the civility politics in Black America. And he kind of does a comparison between Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass. I remember reading about Booker T. Washington and that he was a really great Black American and he did all these great things. And in a lot of ways, all those things are true. And he started one of the first Black universities. Now we call them historically Black colleges and universities. But he was really contrasted with Frederick Douglass, who looks at Douglass as saying there's dirty work that needs to be done to make change. We can't just try to be civil about it. We have to get in there and say, here's the brutal truth of things. We need to deal with this. And Booker T was much more of an appeaser. And he really wanted to be invited to the White House, and he was never invited to the White House. Douglass was invited to the White House multiple times during Lincoln's presidency. And, a lot of that is that Zamolin kind of argues is because Booker T. Washington was much more of an appeaser than someone who is trying to cause ruckus and trying to force people to see what the reality really was. And I would argue that based off of the way that Zamolin, who clearly had a bias, but he clearly thought that Frederick Douglass was the much more effective of these two great men and who drove more abolition thinking than Booker T. Washington. Of course, bear in mind that these two men existed in different time periods. Booker T. Washington was during Jim Crow, and Frederick Douglass was during slavery. And so they're operating in different contexts in a lot of ways. So they're trying to achieve different goals. So abolition for Booker T. Washington was more around prison and Jim Crow and poll taxes and 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 getting rid of the sharecroppers, and Booker T. and Frederick Douglass was trying to get rid of the institution of slavery. And so they had different contexts, and that probably shaped their individual politics in a lot of ways. And I for me looking in, I can't really say who was right or wrong. They both had a positive impact, but Zamelin is arguing that Booker T. Washington could have been more effective if he had been less civil about things. And he also goes on to compare the language of Donald Trump with his clear racist remarks, his masks off policy, with the quotes from Michelle Obama, "When they go low, we go high," which Hillary Clinton picked up in her campaign, and the uncivil language that Donald Trump was using. It didn't matter what Clinton said. If she called them deplorables, whenever he was calling Mexicans rapists, Clinton got clearly targeted for her language of deplorables. She was like made the front page of the New York Times, whereas I don't know if it actually did or not, but it certainly made the front page of like Fox News. Whereas, so there's a different level of standard being held here, and I think that claiming that you need to have civility, is feeding into that, where you can have different sorts of languages from the right than on the left, and that is a weapon that is a politicized weapon that is being used. And Zamelin argues that we're dealing with politics. Politics is not a clean thing. It's not like playing sport. It is life and death. It is about leaving people caged for most of their life, leaving them in abhorrent conditions like solitary confinement. There's nothing civil about that. There's nothing that is, other countries look at it and see it as a human rights violation. Why should we be civil about talking about these things? Why shouldn't we be protesting about this? And in a lot of ways, that's where the second book, like this Radicalize You by Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba, comes in. This book was published May of 2023. And from a timing perspective, like the Against Civility kind of ends during the beginning of the Trump administration, and the paperback version, or the version that I have of Let This Radicalize You, carried through at least a little bit of the Biden administration, not a whole lot, but it definitely carried through all of the Trump administration and all the pandemic. And so in a lot of ways, I really feel like these are books that talk about similar topics, but with different approaches. But this book, Let This Radicalize You, really focuses on the Trump administration, COVID, George Floyd, and some of the after effects of that. There are some cases where this book does talk about events that happened in 2023, and I think that's because there's some things that have been updated with the paperback and e version of things. This book does specifically talk about Charlie Kirk in it. It talks about the way that people like Charlie Kirk talked about George Floyd. It talks about different dog whistles that are used, plus the intentional way that racist language is used to describe Black men and leftists in general. And I really like the source of the name of this book. It's Let This Radicalize You. Don't let this make you despair is actually the whole sentence that Kaba says to activists. And I think that's a good message, because things that we can always have a couple different ways of taking things that are happening in the world. We can say, this is overwhelming and more than I can handle, so I'm going to despair about it. Or this is something that I need to go and do something about. And Cobb is advocating that you should let that change you in a way to go and do something about it. And I think that these two books are interesting because Against Civility talks about using blunter, honest, harsher language to criticize your opponents. And Radicalize You argues for finding joy and hope within co-strugglers within the movement of abolitionists, people who are out struggling against, defunding the police and things like that. And I have to admit, I struggle with parts of Let This Radicalize You. And I think that is because I find some of it a little cringe, a little too earnest. And I think that, to be honest, that's part of the point. And I saw this Blue Sky message post the other day about cringe with protesting. And they're like, yes, it is cringe. That's the point. It's okay to be cringe. And I think that part of what Hayes and Kaba are trying to say is that, yes, you need to take a step away from the cynicism. You need to embrace the cringe. You need to embrace the authenticity of these protests and say, yes, this is what I believe in. This is what I stand for. And that's okay. And, because of that, you see great pictures like this, where this 65-year-old man goes out and protests. And it is the hardest picture that I've seen this year about in protests. And it is phenomenal. And it's authentic and it's real. And that is something that drives people to pay attention. Authenticity. Now, some of it does feel like, you do little lights to highlight, something. It lights up, release this person. And it feels insufficient. And that's something that even the advocates, the activists and organizers admit to, that sometimes it is difficult to avoid cynicism. It is difficult to think that you're doing enough. But what ends up happening often is that some of these little protests get picked up and there's an outsized response from public officials, where there was 24 people protesting out, or maybe it was a dozen activists, I can't exactly remember, for protesting out of J.B. Pritzker's home in Chicago. They were pushing for someone to be tried as a juvenile rather than an adult, especially because they'd been sexually assaulted by their father for 8 years. They tried to get help. No one was willing to help them. They did everything right, and the system failed them at every turn. And the system was trying to punish them for what they did in killing their father to defend themselves and treat them as an adult. And I think that is crazy, especially if you read anything about trauma, that young person was traumatized in such a way that they didn't have a childhood, that they are stuck in those events. But even that small protest, that was only one night that was at this event, but there was a lot of letter writing and other sort of things that went on that continually raised awareness that the pressured Chicago and the DA to lower the charges, to charge her as a juvenile. And I think that this book also kind of has you think about, what does it mean to be on the radical left? And I think that's important because we're being told that the radical left and right are the same. And I think that there are extremists on the left, but I don't think that people who are radicalized in the way that Trump is describing them, or that even Hayes and Kaba are talking about, are really at the same level as a Charlie Kirk. He's advocating for political violence, that gun violence is acceptable, so we can have right to bear arms.
Nonsense. It's drivel. But I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year, so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights.
And a lot of the things that they talk about in Let This Radicalize You is just caring for your fellow Americans. You're at a protest, you take snacks and water, and you provide ways for people to be treated whenever eventually the tear gas starts flying. That is such a little thing. That is just being human. Providing mutual aid, providing monetary support so people can get out of jail whenever they've been arrested for protest. Protest is something that is inherently an American thing. It is enshrined in our Bill of Rights. It is something that we should all be willing to do and able to do. And I don't think mutual aid is that big of a deal either. I've given mutual aid. I think that helping people survive, Indiegogo is probably the largest mutual aid platform in the world right now, and it focuses on healthcare, and primarily, and helping someone get their healthcare is mutual aid. You're helping somebody survive in a system that is not letting healthcare be accessible for them. We need to recognize what the difference is of protests between the left and the right as well. You have these cringy protests on the left that have signs, and in several states in the U.S., after Heather Heyer was killed by a white nationalist that drove through a protest, the right looked at it and was like, hey, that's pretty damn effective. And they passed laws to protect people who drove through protests. And that level of violence isn't even in the same world of existence. Like throwing back canisters of capsaicin back at the police is considered, assault with a weapon, deadly weapon, and they're allowing cars to drive into people. Again, this is also the state seeing violence against the state in the form of protest as not valid, not acceptable. Protests that are supporting the state, violence action supporting the state, is deputized. I have to say that one of the things that I was most surprised about this book is that it is one of the best books about leaderships that I've read in a long time. And I read a lot of business books. I probably shouldn't have been surprised, considering this book is about organizers and activists. And organizers are leaders. They're just not business leaders. They're a different type, and they are dealing with mostly volunteers, dealing with people who are very passionate about what they're doing. They're spending their free time protesting. And I think it's a good tool to read, to see how to be a leader, because in leftist spaces there's a lot of people who are vulnerable. They've been hurt in a lot of ways. They're young. They're not used to being treated this way, and they're looking for someone to listen and help them become full adults and full parts of American society. And this book also does a really good job of explaining how people can change as leaders. So there's a guy named Ali Wayne who discusses his growth as a leader, where at first he is an angry man who has to be right about the language, who really cares about the language that's being used, and that alienates potential allies that could help him. So he learned that it was more important to be on the same page generally with people, and that the people that are that are there that care about these things, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to use imperfect language. And your job is to help them learn why that language is harmful and not to treat them as if they are villains for using that. And to create a psychologically safe space for those people to grow into the type of activist that you want them to be. They may never agree with you on everything. No one ever will. I mean, leftist politics is just fraught with so many people having slightly different views of things that make them antagonists. For example, like calling someone an illegal immigrant, which is a really powerful right wing tool for controlling the language and discussion around immigration and people coming into the United States. That was a trigger for Wayne, but it's also something you have to deprogram people from. Calling people who are here that are here to try and help their families that cross the border committing a civil crime that has been just bombarded into us by Democrats, Republicans, far right speakers, that you have to help them. You have to help people unlearn that language. It's the same with calling the homeless, translating from calling the homeless to being the unhoused or other language where you're not focusing on the fact that they're homeless as a part of their identity to that they are in a state of being unhoused, which, in some ways it doesn't matter, but in other ways you're saying that this person, you're centering them as a person first who has the condition of not having a home. And that creates a different way of looking at things where we're criminalizing homelessness, but if we're looking at them as unhoused, we can say, well, we need to house them so that we can start solving the other problems that they have. And that language can help with changing the way that we talk about things. So I definitely recommend this from a perspective of, if you want to learn how to lead people who are complicated, who have a lot of emotions about what they're doing, this is a very good book about it. You kind of need to switch your brain to thinking about it that way, but I think that it does a very good job. It also talks about the mistakes that you're going to make as a leader and how you're going to talk inelegantly. You're going to say the wrong thing, and you're going to upset some people, and what you can do to address that, and the humility you need to admit that you're wrong, which are all useful tools for leaders. You can't have a leader who always thinks they're right in any organization. Plus, I think that this book has a lot of great suggestions around self-care that every leader in any organization needs. So I think that these books speak to the political moment that we're in. They highlight the limits of our current democratic leadership, highlights the limitations that are put on Black and brown people, what they can say, how white people have an ability to say uncivil things in ways that our Black and brown Americans cannot. And especially white men in suits can say things and be elevated as serious thinkers like Ezra Klein is doing to Charlie Kirk right now, whenever they should just, these people should just be dismissed. Charlie Kirk should not be treated with any modicum of respect. We should be yelling rude things at Charlie Kirk. We should be shouting him down in protest. We should go and protest the things that we don't support. And we support the activists who are going and doing the protesting if you cannot go protest. You can give money, you can give food, you can give other material support. Even if you can't go yourself, giving money to the people deep in the fight can help keep that movement going. There's always going to be some group of people who have been doing it longer than you have, so you don't have to start it. You can join someone. Personally, because of my multiple chemical sensitivities, I can't go. I mean, I can't even wear some t-shirts. So walking into any of these chemical weapons, they would probably kill me. So I've supported bail funds, civil liberty unit organizations like the ACLU, EFF, Amnesty International, International Rescue Council, and a bunch of others. There's a lot of ways that you can support a lot of organizations. You can also find a very local organization that supports youth, because supporting youth and keeping them off the street is considered generally leftist, and it's something that we should support because it means that we don't have a kid that could be criminal in the criminal pipeline. So what do you think? What do you think about these two books? Do you think that I'm way off my rocker thinking about these books? Do you give to groups like this? Do you think that we should be more civil rather than less civil? And do you think that reading a book about the radical left could be a good leadership book, or not? Give me your thoughts below. I really appreciate your comments. Please comment, like, subscribe. And I really appreciate you taking time to listen to me rant on about these books. It really means a lot. And I hope that you have a good day.